2. 4 hours went by in the blink of an eye. The ice on the marsh had melted, and the warriors were gathered by the main gate. Not many had lived through the fierce battle of the previous day to participate in this one. In total, they were 316. The reason only warriors were participating was because Shishoryu had said,
"There aren't a lot of enemies, so if we go out there with too many men, we'll just get in one another's way."
At a glance, it seemed like a legitimate reason, but of course, the truth was something else. Sardyusu gazed at the gathered Lizardman warriors from a slightly removed position. Their bodies were painted with the crests that proved the ancestral spirits had descended among them, and the willpower on their faces could cut like a knife. It didn't seem like anyone had defeat on their minds. Lizardmen nearby cheered for the warriors. Among them, there were many who couldn't hide their fears. Sardyusu struggled to fake confidence, so his internal hesitation wouldn't show, so the others wouldn't realize this battle was an offering to the King of Death. This fight was for the King of Death to show off his strength to the Lizardmen, to obliterate their will to resist. They had no chance of victory from the start, and behind Shishoryu's earlier statement was the desire to keep the victims to a minimum. Sardyusu looked away from the Lizardmen and shot a penetrating glare at the enemy side. The skeletons hadn't taken a single step from their previous positions. He couldn't see the monster Cocytus among them.
"He can't just be one of these skeletons, can he? This is the King of Death's aid. He won't be any ordinary monster."
He was sure he would feel it all the way to the tip of his tail when he laid eyes on him. From behind Sardyusu, as he sank into his gloom, came the signature splashing sound of someone heavy wading through the marsh.
"Yo, Sardyusu!"
Zenbel called out to him in his usual carefree voice. Not a thing was different about him, even though they were about to go to their deaths.
"Morale is awesome, huh?"
"Yeah, it'll be great if they can maintain it while they face that Cocytus monster."
"Right? Oh, is it already time?"
Shishoryu was at the gate. All the Lizardmen turned their attention to him and the 2 swamp elementals next to him. Krush wasn't there. She was pouring magical energy into the swamp elemental summoning. Between that and the long-term effective defense spells she'd cast on Sardyusu, she probably wouldn't be able to move when she was done. She'd used so much magical energy. In fact, she'd told him that when the 2 of them had left the house, that she probably wouldn't see him again, because she'd be passed out from using so much energy. Feeling lonely with no one next to him, Sardyusu looked in the direction where he thought Krush would be. Her expression when they had parted was tearing up his heart.
"Warriors, we march!"
Shishoryu's call to boost their fighting spirit sent the morale of the Lizardmen in the area soaring. They were full of excitement.
"I have to get back to the warriors."
Sardyusu put a lid on the thoughts in his mind. The Lizardmen walked slowly forth with Shishoryu and the 2 swamp elementals out in front. They were leaving the village so that it wouldn't get caught up in the fight. Sardyusu and Zenbel walked at the rear. Sardyusu suddenly turned to look back. Those shabby mud walls, the worried Lizardmen watching, and... He breathed a faint sigh, cleared everything from his mind, and walked on, without murmuring the name of the female on the tip of his tongue. The Lizardmen walked through the marsh and took up a position midway between the village and the enemy skeletons. They weren't thinking about ranks. They were just scattered around, waiting for the fight to begin. At most, they'd have each tribe's chief, Sardyusu, and the 2 elementals out front. The enemy had probably been waiting for Sardyusu and company to arrive. The skeletons banged on their shields and stomped the ground. If the timing had been off, it would have just been noise, but the undead transformed the racket into a harmonious sound. It was so magnificent that anywhere but here it would have been worthy of applause. While the sound attracted all the Lizardmen's attention, Trees behind the skeletons in the forest started falling over. There was only one reason huge trees with thick trunks like that would fall. Someone was cutting them down. A commotion went through the Lizardmen. Since they couldn't see anyone, it was possible to imagine that multiple people were working together to cut them down. But the trees were crashing at intervals too precise for that to be true. It might have been possible, considering the perfectly ordered command of the undead they'd witnessed before, but none of the Lizardmen thought so. A strange feeling passed through their minds, that it was the work of a single actor. What was strangest of all was that they couldn't hear a blade hitting the tree trunks until right before the trees collapsed. In other words, impossible as it might seem, someone incredibly strong must have been felling the thick trees with a single swing. Cutting a huge tree in two, how much arm strength and what kind of blade would one need to do such a thing? The sound of the falling trees combined with the rhythm of the skeletons banging their shields and slowly approached the Lizardmen. The defenders were shaken. Of course they were. There wasn't anyone who wouldn't be shaken under those circumstances. Even Zenbel, Zardayusu, and Shishoryu, who had braced themselves, were shaken. They were just skillfully hiding it. Eventually, the figure cutting through the forest came into view. At the same time, the skeleton's banging stopped. In the unnatural silence was a mass of polished light blue. It sparkled so intensely, it made one wonder how much light it would reflect if the sky weren't covered by that thick cloud. The being looked like an 8-foot-tall bipedal insect. If the face of an ant and a praying mantis were combined, and then demonically warped, it would probably look like this. The hard exoskeleton encasing his body was wrapped in a chill that sparkled like diamond dust. From his sturdy tail, that was more than double his height, sprouted countless spikes. His powerful lower jaws could surely sever a human arm with no trouble. His 4 arms featured sharp claws and were equipped with dazzling vambraces. From his neck hung a golden disc, and he wore silver anklets. The appearance of an absolute power on par with the King of Death.
So that's Cocytus.
Zardayusu's heart pounded, and at some point his breath had turned ragged. None of the Lizardmen had anything to say. Their eyes were drawn to the being who had shown himself, and they couldn't tear them away, not even if they were scared. Without realizing it, they began to retreat. These Lizardmen, who had boosted their morale before coming, and Zardayusu and company, who had braced themselves for this moment, they all quailed before the appearance of this overwhelmingly powerful opponent.
I get that the King of Death and his entourage weren't going to fight us, but I had no idea how terrifying a powerful opponent who was ready to fight could be.
The monster they were up against was enough to make even Zardayusu want to run away, and he had a spell on him that should have cancelled out fear. It was a miracle that the Lizardmen who hadn't received spells weren't scrambling to flee. Cocytus advanced toward them with slow steps. His imposing figure entered the marsh and passed along the skeletons. When he'd approached to about 30 yards from the Lizardmen, he stopped. Then he moved the insect head on top of his long, thin neck, as if he was looking for someone. Zardayusu felt the gaze stop for a moment on him.
Now then, Lord Ainz is watching. Please show me your spirit. But first, Ice Pillar.
He repeated the spell, and about 20 yards away, between him and the Lizardmen, 2 pillars of ice thrust up out of the water.
It may be rude to you warriors who came here prepared, but allow me to tell you something. Across that line is death. If you insist on advancing past it, know that death awaits you.
Cocytus crossed two of his arms. It was a posture that said he made the rules.
Hey, he's actually a pretty nice guy.
Zaryusu nodded as if agreeing with Zenbel's outburst. Then he took a step forward. Following him, Zenbel, Shishoryu, and the other two chiefs took a step. Shishoryu turned around and called out to the warriors who were about to follow them.
You guys can stay here. No, go back to the village. Otherwise you'll probably get mixed up in this and be killed. Hey, let us fight with you. We are scared, but still. It's not cowardly to pull out. It's important to live. Then why? Some lizardmen can't withdraw. That's just the way it is. How could a chief let his tribe get conquered without putting up a fight? But chief, we'll fight too. Hold up, young fellows, go home. Leave the rest to us old fogies.
The lizardmen who had pushed their way to the front were plenty old, but still far too young to be called elderly. There were about 57 of them. When the others saw their expressions, they didn't know what to say. If there had been emotions like determination or resignation on their faces, the younger ones might have offered to accompany them, but their expressions contained a wish. The wish that those younger than them would survive and enjoy life. The warriors, who had no words, moved off to the rear, frustrated. Shishoryu turned back to Cocytus.
Didn't mean to keep you waiting, Cocytus.
Cocytus reached out an arm and curled one of his awfully long, thin fingers. Come at me. In response, Shishoryu roared, Charge! Roar! With a roar from the bottom of their hearts, the determined lizardmen raced across the marsh toward Cocytus. Cocytus eyed the charging lizardmen coldly.
It's a shame, warriors. But first, allow me to thin you out a bit.
It was inconceivable that he would lose, even if they all reached him. Cocytus just judged that he should be selective. Cocytus, as a warrior, would have rather shown respect and waited until they were in attack range to fight them. But under the circumstances, he was receiving far more favor than he deserved. Allowing the rabble to cross swords with the guardian of the great tomb of Nazarick would be disrespectful to the one watching. Cocytus unleashed his sealed aura. It was an ability from his Knight of Niflheim class. Frost Aura. The skill slightly inhibited the user's opponent's movement while dealing extreme chill damage. If he had put it on full blast, the lizardmen watching the battle would have been in range. But he didn't want to do that. He held back the power. Shorter range, less damage.
This seems about right.
An arctic frost spread out from Cocytus to cover an area with a radius of about 25 yards. The dramatic change in temperature caused the atmosphere to rumble.
Okay, that's probably enough.
He suppressed his aura. It lasted almost no time. The ranging cold vanished as if it had never been there. But it definitely hadn't been a dream or an illusion. The proof was the 57 lizardman bodies littering the marsh. Only 5 could still move, the strongest 5. With neither fear nor hesitation at the death of their comrades, or Cocytus's power, they leaped into action at once. A rock flew through the air. The first one to rush forward was the lizardman in armor. 2 others followed him. The 2 swamp elementals, their bodies cracked from the chill, weren't as nimble, and moved slowly behind them. The last lizardman cast a spell. That stone, the first attack, had been aimed at Cocytus's neck, but it was pointless because
all guardians have resistance to projectile weapons via an item or whatnot.
The rock was deflected as if it had hit an invisible shield. The next challenger, the one running out in front, was the Razortail chief, wearing one of the 4 great treasures, white dragon bone. It was hard enough to repel Zardayusu's frost pain, and the strongest armor available to the Lizardmen. Facing him, Cocytus drew a sword out of the air, as if he'd been holding it secretly in space. It was an odachi, a sword with a blade easily 6 feet long, called Imperial Sword Zanshin. It was the keenest weapon of the 21 in his possession. And now he swung it at the oncoming Lizardman. His swordsmanship was so sharp it practically cut the air itself, and the atmosphere's scream, a musical tone, echoed throughout the area. If it weren't for the situation, it would have been a pleasantly serene sound. The moment after, the chief, armor and all, was sliced vertically in 2, and the 2 halves separated and collapsed into the marsh. Cocytus had cut through the Lizardmen's strongest armor without putting even a nick in Imperial Sword Zanshin. Without letting the death before their eyes faze them, the next 2 Lizardmen split, one left, one right, and raised their weapons. Ah! From the right, Zenbel's spear hand stabbed towards Cocytus's face with the power of natural iron weapon and iron skin. From the left, Frostpain stabbed toward his abdomen. The attacks were based on the logic that in close combat it was difficult to use long weapons. Of course, that went for only ordinary combatants. Cocytus made a subtle dodge and took Zenbel's arm from the side with the middle of his blade. He moved with the long sword exactly as if it were part of his body. Iron skin made Zenbel's skin as hard as steel, but Imperial Sword Zanshin's sharpness had already been proven on white dragon bone. The blade bit smoothly into his arm and continued in a graceful motion to the water's surface, easily severing the limb. Ah! As blood spurted from Zenbel's stump of a right arm, Cocytus caught Frostpain in his other hand.
Aha! It's not a bad sword, but...
Giving up on pulling Frostpain free, it wouldn't budge. Zardayusu unleashed a kick at Cocytus's knee. Cocytus didn't even attempt to avoid it, and a sharp pain ran through Zardayusu's foot. It was as if he'd kicked a wall, harder than steel, with all his might.
Aura spell! Mass Slight Cure Wounds!
In exchange for a vast amount of magical energy, Shishiryu was able to force a spell from an elite tier he would never normally be able to use, and heal everyone.
Ah!
Cocytus had never seen this magical boost before, and he observed Shishiryu with great interest. The 2 swamp elementals came running in to block his view. They stood between him and Zenbel, whose severed arm was on the mend thanks to the healing spell, and tried to attack with their tentacle-like arms. Before their attacks could connect, however, Cocytus slashed through the both of them, annoyed. As the swamp elementals disintegrated into lumps of mud, Zardayusu punched Cocytus's compound eyes and stomach and chest equivalents. Of course, the one who got hurt was him. He was already bleeding from the broken skin on his hand.
Pesky one, aren't you?
Cocytus swung his spiked tail around and struck Zardayusu hard in the chest. With a cracking sound, Zardayusu's body soared like a ball hit with a bat and crashed into the marsh. After rolling several times through the mud, he finally stopped, but the intense pain in his chest and the blood he was coughing up made it hard to breathe. Had the broken bones in his chest punctured his lungs? He tried to inhale, but the air wouldn't come. It was like being underwater. The warm fluid running down his throat made him nauseous. When he looked at his chest, he saw multiple wounds like knife gouges and a gush of blood flowing from them.
I'm this bad after just one hit?
Desperately struggling to breathe, Zardayusu glared at Cocytus with eyes that still had fight in them, to see if a follow-up attack was coming.
You still have the will to fight. Then I'll give this back.
He tossed Frostpain carelessly near Zardayusu, who was still in the mud, and then ignored him to face the others. Although his arm had grown back, Zenbel had taken a battering, and Shishiryu cast a healing spell on him. Another rock hurtled toward Cocytus as if to say, "I won't let you near them," but it ricocheted uselessly.
"How annoying,"
Cocytus mumbled and casually thrust his hand toward the small-fanged chief.
"Piercing icicle."
He launched dozens of sharp icicles the size of human arms from across a wide area. The icicles had no trouble skewering the sole Lizardman being targeted. One in the chest, 2 in his abdomen, 1 in his right thigh. They all went clear through him. The small-fanged chief, the most talented Lizardman ranger, swayed, then collapsed into the marsh like a marionette whose strings had been cut and died.
Ah! Overspell! Mass Light Cure Wounds!
Zenbel charged, and Shoryu used the healing spell again. Zenbel was trying to buy time for Zaryusu's wounds to heal. He knew it was reckless. All his abilities were powerless in the face of Cocytus's, but he advanced with zero hesitation. When Zenbel came in range, Cocytus casually swung Imperial Sword Zanshin at him. The blow came faster than Zenbel could see, far faster than he was nimble, and the sword had no trouble cutting through his flesh. Zenbel's headless body gushed a fountain of blood and crumpled into the marsh with a splash. His head followed a split second later.
"Now then, 2 left? I heard about you from Lord Ainz, and here you are, the last survivors."
Cocytus, who hadn't moved 1 step from his position when the battle started, gazed at the 2 remaining lizardmen and brandished his katana. Neither blood nor fat clung to the smoky white blade. It was beautiful, as if everything had come off in that 1 stroke. Zaryusu had recovered enough energy to stand, and Shishiryu had drawn his greatsword. They faced Cocytus between them. Zaryusu scooped some of the still pouring blood from his chest and smeared it on his face. It looked like one of the patterns to call down ancestral spirits.
"Zaryusu, how are your wounds?" "Bad. There's still a dull pain, but I can swing my sword a few times." "I see. Well, that's enough. Honestly, I'm pretty much out of magic. If I'm not careful, I might pass out,"
Shishiryu said with a kachi-kachi noise in his teeth that could have passed for laughter. In response, Zaryusu changed his expression slightly.
"Oh, so you're killing yourself too."
Smiling faintly, he exhaled and relaxed his shoulders. He let his sword hand droop. A sharp pain streaked outward from his chest, but he did his best to ignore it. He wasn't about to give up before this was truly over. He was going to keep swinging his sword. He knew full well they couldn't win. There wasn't anything he could do about the defeat they'd been dealt. Still, he couldn't just accept it. Why? Because he'd lied to a lot of souls, told them that winning was possible. There were lizardmen who believed that big, fat lie, so there was no way he could accept this defeat.
"To the very last second, with all my might, I will keep wielding this sword!"
Zaryusu's roar echoed throughout the area. The fangs in Cocytus' jaw closed with a click.
"That's a good roar."
He must have smiled. And it wasn't the sneering smirk of the strong at the weak, but a smile at an equal, a warrior.
"Good, Zaryusu. Just like that. Let's fight this till the very end."
Shishiryu smiled.
"Now then, sorry to have kept you waiting, Sir Cocytus."
Cocytus shrugged in response.
"I don't mind at all. I'm not so boorish that I'd interrupt a farewell between brothers. Are you ready? No, excuse me. You've been ready from the beginning, haven't you?"
As Zaryusu and Shishiryu took a solid step forward, Cocytus brandished Imperial Sword Zanshin and spoke.
"Let's have your names." "Shishiryu Shasha. Zaryusu Shasha. I'll make a note of you as warriors.
And allow me to apologize. Normally, I hold a weapon in each of my arms. But, and I don't say this with disdain, but you just aren't strong enough for me to draw them all.
Isn't that just too bad? Indeed, let's do this!
The two lizardmen dashed at Cocytus. The splashing echoed across the marsh. Cocytus cocked his head slightly at their staggered timing. They wouldn't both enter the range of his sword at the same time. Shishiryu would arrive first.
They must have a plan,
he thought, and waited for them with a vague sense of excitement. The first one to enter his range would be Shishiryu. Cocytus watched to see what he would do. Right at the very edge of where Cocytus's blade would reach, Shishiryu stopped, and Earthbind! Cast a spell. Countless chains of mud reached out toward Cocytus. At the same time, Zaryusu ran for all he was worth. He hid Frostpain behind his back, so his range couldn't be guessed. Shishiryu's comment about being out of magic had been nothing more than a bluff to trick Cocytus. If he fell for it, he might get caught in the chains and stabbed by the one running up from behind.
No matter how hard its exoskeleton is, the tip of my sword should penetrate if I put all my strength into it.
With that sentiment fueling his charge, the attack of a man who had abandoned defense would be quite powerful.
You must have a lot of confidence in that sword.
Cocytus understood that sentiment well. He, too, felt strongly about all his weapons. Among them, he had particularly strong feelings for the sword he'd drawn this time, a weapon used by his creator. He was showing them the utmost respect by facing them with Imperial Sword Zanshin, even if it resulted in even more overwhelming power disparity. But they had misunderstood one thing. They were fighting Cocytus, guardian of the 5th level of the Great Tomb of Nazarick.
Your level is too inferior for your spells to get past my defenses.
Just before the mud chains touched Cocytus, they were repelled and fell back into the marsh as plain mud. At that low level, they couldn't penetrate Cocytus's magic defenses.
Icy Burst!
Along with the shout from the rear, white frost swirled around Cocytus, enveloping the area.
A pointless effort.
Cocytus, with his perfect resistance to chill, took the freezing assault as a gentle breeze and waited for Zaryusu or Shishiryu to spring into his range. About a breath later, the chance he'd been waiting for appeared, but he hesitated for just a moment.
Will cutting off his head be enough to stop him?
Zaryusu had abandoned all defense, so Cocytus didn't think so. The sight of the headless body charging on appeared in his mind.
So, slice off his arm first, and then cut off his head? No, that's uncivilized. I'll just slay him with one blow.
Zaryusu's full-speed sprint, with no thought for defense, was hopelessly slow from Cocytus's point of view. In the white haze, the black figure of Zaryusu came dimly into view. Cocytus reached out and deftly grabbed Frostpain's blade, just like before. Was the reason he didn't feel any chill in his fingers because Zaryusu had belatedly realized it didn't work on him? Doubt ran through his mind at how easy it had been to stop the charge, despite the speed, but only for a second. He didn't need to think too hard, because one swing of Imperial Sword Zanshin would end this. Then there would be only one left.
So it was a charge with no plan.
Cocytus went to cut Zaryusu down, a bit disappointed, when he changed his mind.
Aha!
Through the cold hovering in the area, along with the roar, a great sword came down. Shishiryu's strike had enough momentum to whip up a wind to blow away the chill. Earthbind, Zaryusu's charge, and Icy Burst had all been feints. Stabs from Frostpain were worth being on guard against, but Shishiryu's overhead swing would probably deal more damage. Cocytus had no doubt that that was their main attack. However,
if you want to sneak attack, you have to do it quietly.
With the splash of their footfalls plainly audible, it couldn't possibly be a sneak attack.
Was there even any point in taking chill damage to attempt that?
Cocytus wondered.
Or are they just flailing?
But it was true that they'd entered his range.
As long as I'm holding his only weapon, Sardayusu is no enemy. All that changes is the order in which I'll kill them,
thought Cocytus, and he swung his sword. One blow. He sliced Shishoryu, great sword and all, right in half. Before his corpse even hit the marsh, he'd brought his katana back around to cut down Sardayusu, and... just then, Cocytus's fingers slipped on Sardayusu's blade. Taken aback, he checked them.
Why is the sword pushing toward me?
In the midst of the white frost, he saw something red on both his fingers and the blade. He instantaneously figured out what had caused the slip.
Blood?
That was confusing. He wondered when it had gotten there, and understood when he saw Sardayusu's face through the frost. He hadn't been painting a pattern when he'd smeared the blood on his face. He'd gathered the blood to slather it on the blade of his sword. Icy Burst hadn't been to deal damage to Cocytus, or to conceal Shishoryu, but to hide the fact that the blade had blood on it. That was why Sardayusu had held the sword behind his back as well. When Cocytus had stopped Sardayusu's attack before, he'd grabbed the blade of his sword. Sardayusu had remembered that, and made this move on the off chance Cocytus would do the same thing again. Then an electric shock zapped through Cocytus's brain.
That time, when I thought he was rushing at me awfully slowly! Aha! To think he bloodied the blade for an ingenious plan to make it slip and run me through, which wouldn't work more than once. In order to create a definite chance, he held back to make me think it would be easy to grab the sword.
The blade slipped closer and closer to his light blue body. Not even Cocytus could withstand Sardayusu pushing for all he was worth with his full body weight, not when he was using only 2 fingers now, slipping on the blood. If he'd grabbed it at more of a distance, he might have had more options, but at this close range he did not. Cocytus was so moved he shivered. Even leaving everything to chance, this attack had won all its various bets. More than anything, though, if Shishoryu hadn't been around, this situation couldn't have occurred. Shishoryu probably hadn't understood what Sardayusu was trying to do, but he believed in him as his older brother and sacrificed his life. He'd made that pointless sneak attack and war cry to draw attention from his little brother for even just a moment. Just one moment. Literally the time it took to blink. As Frostbane approached with Sardayusu's all behind it, Cocytus clacked his lower jaws together.
Wonderful.
Then the sword stabbed at Cocytus, and glanced off, without leaving so much as a scratch on his sparkling cerulean body. It was the inevitable outcome, born of the unbridgeable gap in ability between the Lizardman and an elite NPC of the Great Tomb of Nazarick.
Sorry, I have a skill that makes me temporarily immune to all weak magic weapons. As long as it's activated, your attacks are meaningless.
Personally, Cocytus would have gladly sustained an injury out of respect for the warrior who had made such a splendid attack. But as a guardian, there was no way he could do that with the Supreme Being watching. Cocytus intentionally took a single step back. It caused mud to splatter and soil his beautiful blue body. A one-step retreat. It didn't mean anything. Nothing happened because of it. Sardayusu was definitely going to die, and Cocytus's victory was absolute. But it was a token of praise, from the absolutely strong Cocytus to the helplessly weak Sardayusu. Sardayusu smiled, a pure smile, reserved for those who knew their fate and had done everything they could to avoid it. As Cocytus swung, Imperial swords on sheen.